Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Cortney Morris. She's an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. Hi, Cortney.
Hi, Sonali.
A Norwegian refugee advocacy group has just released a report revealing that 38 million people were displaced globally last year alone. That's nearly 5 million more than the year before. The record-breaking number includes 11 million refugees who were newly displaced and clustered in the Middle East and North Africa region, including Syria, South Sudan, Nigeria, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Iraq stands out. 2.2 million Iraqis were displaced last year as they fled violence from the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees has endorsed a study by the Norwegian Refugee Council. The Council's Secretary General Jan Egeland said these are the worst figures for forced displacement in a generation, signaling our complete failure to protect innocent civilians. Cortney, isn't the U.S.'s interference in the region at least partly to blame for these terrible statistics? I mean, many have pointed out that the U.S.'s destructive policies in Iraq led to the rise of ISIS, for example.
Well, obviously the sources of the conflict are multiple. There's clearly, on the one hand, the issue of U.S. occupation of Iraq, which has really exacerbated existing tensions on the ground. There's also the issue of deep and sectarian conflict between Shia and Sunni groups battling for economic and political power. And then, of course, there's the emergence of ISIS, which is truly a product of U.S. occupation. And they've literally been able to burn their way across the country using weapons that were acquired from shipments of arms that we sent to the country. And so there's plenty of blame to go around here. But I think that the U.S. as the key figure in the conflict really has, carries the lion's share of the responsibility and has a moral obligation to deal with the crisis of refugees and displacement, and we really have failed in that area. So, for example, since 2007, we've only resettled in the United States 84,000 Iraqi civilians who were displaced because of the conflict. This is nowhere near the number of people who've been affected by our occupation.
And activists in Baltimore, Maryland, have discovered that surveillance planes were circling protest areas in the wake of Freddie Gray's death. Using social media, residents connected with one another to discover what the Washington Post called, quote, a previously secret multi-day campaign of overhead surveillance by city and federal authorities. The ACLU has demanded answers over possible violations of civil liberties. Protesters in Ferguson, Missouri, last summer experienced similar surveillance by helicopter. Meanwhile, Baltimore's Police Commissioner Anthony Batts, in his first interview since the protests, told CNN that he was surprised by the charges against his officers, but admitted that the police are, quote, part of the problem and that there needs to be a rebuilding of trust with the community. Attorney General Loretta Lynch visited Baltimore yesterday and notably showed sympathy to police officers. And this just in, pop superstar Prince has just announced a free Rally for Peace concert in Baltimore this Sunday. Well, Cortney, does Anthony Batts' comment about police being part of the problem surprise you?
I think it was a bit of a surprise, since the Black Lives Matter movement emerged last summer and with the growing numbers of unarmed Black civilians who've been killed by the police, the response from law enforcement has generally been to dig their heels in and to say, we are not the problem, you are the problem. And just a general refusal to face up to the fact that the culture of law enforcement needs to change. And we've seen this in Ferguson. We saw this following the non-indictment of Officer Daniel Pantaleo for the choking death of Eric Garner in New York City. And this has really been a pattern that's been repeated across the country. And so, I think that seeing this, having this response from coming out of Baltimore is important. It's significant. And what it suggests is that if police can begin to understand that they are part of the problem, then perhaps they might also begin to understand that they could be a part of the solution.
Finally, Missouri lawmakers have just voted to override their governor's veto of a bill that will impoverish thousands of children. As part of an ongoing trend to cut off government benefits to poor residents, the Republican-dominated state legislature decided it was important to impose even stricter limits and requirements for recipients of the federal welfare program called TANF. Benefits will now have a lifetime limit of 3 years and 9 months, down from 5 years. Some funding will also be diverted to alternatives to abortion and promoting marriage and fatherhood. The Department of Social Services estimated that nearly 10,000 people would lose benefits in the first year of implementation, 6,400 of whom are children. Governor Jay Nixon had refused to sign the bill into law, saying, quote, I don't sign bills that hurt kids, period. Cortney, do we need any more evidence of how much Republicans seem to hate poor people, especially poor children?
No, we don't. I mean, but I think we also need to recognize that it's not just Republicans, right? I mean, we live in a country that just generally hates the poor and doesn't want to take responsibility for them. And I think we don't like to think about the fact that many of the people who are living in poverty have been pushed into it by the same kinds of neoliberal economic policies that have really destroyed the working class in this country and are making the survival of the middle class increasingly tenuous. And measures like these, I think, are just another example of the kinds of mean-spirited public policies that punish the poor for being poor while refusing to take responsibility for the reasons of for their poverty and to offer them meaningful strategies out of poverty. So it's not surprising that this is a measure that we're seeing developing from the right. I guess this is what compassionate conservatism looks like these days.
Wow. Well, thanks as always, Courtney, for joining us today.
Bye, Sonali.
We'll talk to you next week. Cortney Morris is an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. This is Uprising. We'll be right back.